The iron bars pressed cold against Sarna Vek's bruised shoulders as the cage door slammed shut. And through the roar of the crowd, she heard the announcer call her tomorrow's featured attraction in the blood-soaked fighting pit. She had survived 3 battles already, each more brutal than the last, her green skin mottled with purple welts and cuts that still wept despite her orcish healing. The humans who ran this underground arena in the border town of Greystone had captured her 2 weeks ago while she traveled alone through disputed territory, far from her clan's northern holds. They had beaten her unconscious, chained her wrists, and thrown her into this nightmare of jeering crowds and forced combat. The other cages around her held creatures of various kinds, a scarred wolf that paced endlessly, a goblin who gibbered in the corner, and across the dim torch-lit chamber, another orc warrior who had stopped moving 3 days ago. Sarna pressed her forehead against the bars and breathed through the sharp ache in her ribs where her last opponent, a man with spiked gauntlets, had landed a vicious blow. She was strong, trained by her father in the ways of combat before sickness took him, but she was not invincible. Eventually, they would match her against something she could not defeat, and she would die here in this stinking underground warren while humans screamed for her blood. Footsteps echoed across the stone floor, multiple sets moving with purpose. Sarna lifted her head, her small tusks catching the torchlight as she bared her teeth instinctively. A group of men approached, led by the arena master, a corpulent man named Targus who wore rings on every finger and smelled of sour wine. Behind him walked a younger man, perhaps 25 summers, with dark hair that fell past his collar and clothes that marked him as someone with coin but not nobility. He wore a simple gray shirt and dark trousers, boots still dusty from travel, and his brown eyes moved across the cages with an expression Sarna could not immediately identify. "Here she is," Targus announced, gesturing toward Sarna's cage with a flourish. "The savage beauty herself. 3 victories, each one a spectacular show. Tomorrow she faces the Thornblade champion, and I guarantee the crowd will pay triple to see that match." He paused, studying his nails. "But for the right price, she could be yours tonight, fighting slave laborer, whatever purpose you have in mind." The younger man stepped closer to Sarna's cage, and she met his gaze with all the defiance she could muster despite her exhaustion. His eyes were not cruel, she realized with surprise. They carried something else, something that looked almost like pain as they traveled over her visible injuries. "How much?" His voice was quiet, controlled. Targus named a sum that made 2 of his guards whistle appreciatively. It was an outrageous amount, enough to buy a small farm with livestock and equipment. Sarna felt her heart sink further. No one would pay that for a captive orc. This was just another form of torture, dangling false hope before her. The young man reached into his coat and withdrew a heavy leather purse. "I have half that in coin now. I can bring you a signed note from the Merchants Guild for the rest, redeemable tomorrow." Targus's eyes widened, then narrowed with avarice. "Let me see the coin." What followed was a tense negotiation that Sarna watched through a haze of disbelief. The young man she heard Targus call him, Wilton Hartley, counted out an impossible amount of silver and gold onto a small table the guards brought over. He spoke calmly, never raising his voice, but with an intensity that suggested he would not be refused. Finally, Targus agreed, greed overcoming his desire to see Sarna die in tomorrow's scheduled fight. Keys rattled in the lock. Sarna tensed, unsure what new horror awaited her. Perhaps this man had purchased her for some private torture or worse. The cage door swung open and Wilton Hartley stood at the entrance, his expression serious. "You are free to go," he said simply. No chains, no conditions. Walk out of here and go home to your people." Sarna stared at him, certain she had misheard through the ringing in her ears from her earlier beating. "What? You heard me." He stepped aside, giving her a clear path. "Leave. Now, before anyone changes their mind," Targus sputtered behind him. "Now see here, the purchase was for the slave herself. You cannot just—" "I bought her," Wilton said, his voice hardening. "What I do with my property is my business, and I choose to free her." He turned back to Sarna, and she saw the sincerity in his eyes, along with something fierce and determined. "Please, go quickly." Sarna's legs shook as she emerged from the cage for the first time in 2 weeks. Every instinct screamed that this was a trap, that guards would tackle her the moment she tried to leave, but Wilton moved ahead of her toward the stairs that led up and out. She followed, her bare feet silent on the cold stone, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. The guards watched, but made no move to stop her, clearly under orders from their master, who was still arguing in low, furious tones with Wilton about the proprieties of the sale. The night air hit her face like a blessing from the old gods. Sarna stood in the alley behind the building that housed the fighting pits, breathing in the scent of rain and distant pine forests. Freedom. It was real. She turned to look at Wilton, who had followed her up and now stood watching her with those same pained, serious eyes. "Why?" The word came out as a rasp. Her throat was dry from disuse and screaming during fights, because it was wrong. He said it as though it were the simplest thing in the world. "Go north. Stay off the main roads for the first few days. They might try to recapture you." Sarna took a step toward him, studying his face in the moonlight. He was handsome in a quiet way, with strong features and a jaw that suggested stubbornness. "You spent a fortune." "I spent money." He shrugged slightly. "It is just metal and paper. You are a living being who deserves freedom." The mathematics are not complicated. Something in his matter-of-fact tone, in the simple decency of his action, cracked through the armor Sarna had built around herself during her captivity. She felt tears burn at the corners of her eyes, but refused to let them fall. "I have nothing to repay you with. I ask for no repayment." He glanced back toward the door, worry crossing his features. "Please, you should go before Targus decides to send men after you regardless of our deal." Sarna nodded slowly. She wanted to say more, to express the magnitude of what he had done, but words felt inadequate. Instead, she pressed her fist to her chest in the orcish gesture of deepest gratitude, then turned and ran. Her body protested, muscles screaming, but she pushed through the pain and did not stop until she had left Greystone far behind and collapsed beneath a stand of oak trees at the forest's edge. The next 3 days were a blur of pain and survival. Sarna's injuries were worse than she had realized, and without proper food or rest, her healing was slow. She made it perhaps 20 miles north before fever set in, turning her thoughts to confusion and her vision to swimming shadows. She found a shallow cave and crawled inside, shivering despite the summer warmth, and surrendered to the delirium. When clarity finally returned, she opened her eyes to find herself in a bed. Panic surged through her, but the room around her was not a cell. It was simple but clean, with whitewashed walls and a window that showed green fields beyond. The blanket over her was patched but soft, and someone had bandaged her worst wounds. She sat up too quickly and immediately regretted it as the room spun. "Easy." That voice. Wilton Hartley appeared in the doorway carrying a bowl that steamed gently. "You have been unconscious for 2 days. Your fever broke last night." Sarna stared at him, then around the room again. "Where am I?" "My farm, about 30 miles north of Greystone." He set the bowl on a small table beside the bed. "It is just broth, but you should try to eat. You were starving." "How did I get here? I found you in the cave. I was traveling the same direction and saw your tracks." He pulled up a simple wooden chair and sat, keeping a respectful distance. "You were burning with fever, calling out in the orcish tongue. I could not leave you there. You should have." The words came out harsher than Sarna intended. "Helping an orc will bring you nothing but trouble from your own people." "My own people," Wilton said quietly, "include quite a few who deserve trouble." He gestured to the broth. "Please eat. We can argue philosophy after you have recovered your strength." Sarna wanted to refuse, to maintain some shred of pride, but hunger won out. She reached for the bowl with shaking hands and sipped carefully. The broth was simple but rich, warming her from the inside. Wilton watched her with that same serious expression, and she found herself studying him in return. In the daylight streaming through the window, she could see the calluses on his hands, the way his simple clothes were work-worn. This was no wealthy merchant's son, despite the fortune he had spent on her freedom. "That money," she said between sips. "You said it was nothing, but these clothes, this house, you are not rich." "No." He looked down at his hands. "That was everything I had saved over the last 5 years. I sold my best breeding bull the day before and added it to what I had set aside." Sarna set down the bowl, her appetite suddenly gone despite her hunger. "Why would you do that? For a stranger? For an orc?" Wilton was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. "My older brother, Edmund, was a soldier on the northern border. 7 years ago he was wounded in a skirmish and separated from his unit. He would have died in the snow, but an orc woman found him. She brought him to her family's shelter, tended his wounds, and kept him alive through a blizzard that lasted 5 days. When the weather cleared, she led him back to human territory and left before he could even thank her properly." He looked up at Sarna, and she saw old grief in his eyes. "Edmund survived that, but he died 3 years later from a fever. Before he passed, he made me promise something. He said that if I ever had the chance to repay the debt he owed, to show mercy to an orc in need, I should take it no matter the cost. When I saw you in that cage, I heard his voice in my head as clearly as if he stood beside me." Sarna felt her throat tighten. "I am sorry for your loss. And I am sorry for what my people did to you." Wilton stood, moving toward the door. "Rest. There is more broth when you are hungry again, and clean clothes in the trunk by the window. You are welcome to stay as long as you need to heal. When you are ready to travel, I will give you supplies for the journey north." He left before she could respond, and Sarna lay back against the pillows, her mind reeling. She had been taught from childhood that humans were treacherous, that they would smile while sharpening their knives for your back. Yet this man had bankrupted himself to free her, then saved her life a second time with nothing to gain. The cognitive dissonance made her head ache worse than her injuries. Over the next week, Sarna healed slowly in Wilton's small farmhouse. The property was modest, perhaps 40 acres of mixed crops and pasture land, with a barn that housed 3 dairy cows, a handful of chickens, and an aging plow horse named Dorothy. Wilton worked from dawn until dusk, and Sarna watched from her window as he moved through his daily tasks with quiet efficiency. He brought her meals 3 times a day but never lingered, always respectful of her space and clearly trying not to make her feel like a prisoner despite her weakness. On the 8th day, Sarna woke feeling almost like herself again. Her ribs no longer screamed with every breath, and the cuts on her arms and legs had closed fully, leaving only faint scars. She rose and dressed in the clothes Wilton had provided, simple work trousers and a tunic that had clearly been his brother's, judging by the size. They fit her reasonably well, as she was tall for an orc woman and broad-shouldered from years of training. She found Wilton in the barn, milking one of the cows with practiced hands. He looked up as she entered, surprise crossing his features. "You should still be resting," he said, though there was no censure in his tone. "I have rested enough." Sarna crossed her arms, feeling suddenly awkward. "I am healed. I should leave before I bring trouble to your door." Wilton studied her for a moment, then returned his attention to the milking. "If you are determined to go, I will not stop you, but may I suggest waiting until tomorrow? There is a patrol that passes on the main road every 8th day. Better to let them pass before you travel." The simple practicality of his advice struck Sarna as both wise and kind. She nodded slowly. "Tomorrow, then." "In the meantime," Wilton said, finishing with the cow and standing with the full pail, "if you feel up to it, I could use help with the evening chores. The work has been piling up." It was clearly a polite fiction. Sarna had watched him manage everything alone for over a week, but she appreciated the gesture. Working would be better than sitting in the house feeling useless. "Show me what needs doing." They fell into an easy rhythm over the course of the day. Sarna gathered eggs from the chicken coop, discovering that hens had very strong opinions about having an orc reach into their nesting boxes. Wilton chopped wood for the stove, his axe rising and falling with the steady confidence of long practice. Together they weeded the kitchen garden, and Sarna found herself relaxing in the simple, honest work. There was something healing about putting her hands in the soil, about helping things grow instead of fighting for her life in a blood-soaked pit. As the sun set, Wilton prepared a simple dinner of bread, cheese, and the vegetables they had harvested. They ate at the small kitchen table, and for the first time, Sarna felt comfortable enough to ask questions. "Why do you live alone? No family?" "My parents passed when I was 16 and Edmund was 18. Fever took mother, and father followed 6 months later from a heart that gave out. Edmund joined the army shortly after, and I kept the farm running." Wilton tore off a piece of bread, his expression distant. "After Edmund died, I thought about selling, moving to one of the larger towns. But this land has been in my family for 3 generations. It felt wrong to let it go. It is lonely, though." Sarna said it as an observation, not a question. "Yes." He met her eyes, and she saw the honesty there. "Very lonely sometimes, but I have the animals and my work. It is enough." "Is it?" Wilton smiled faintly, and Sarna realized it was the first time she had seen him smile. It transformed his face, softening the serious lines around his mouth. "Most days I tell myself it is. Other days, I wonder what I am working for if there is no one to share it with." Sarna felt an unexpected kinship with his words. "My clan exiled me 3 months ago. I was born different, too curious about humans, too willing to question the old hatreds. When I spoke against a planned raid on a human settlement, farmers with children, no soldiers, the elders cast me out. They said I had lost my orc heart." She touched her chest, over where that heart beat. "So I understand loneliness." "I am sorry," Wilton said quietly. "That must have been painful." "Less painful than compromising my principles." Sarna surprised herself with the words, realizing they were true. "Though exile is what led me to be captured. I was traveling alone, trying to reach the eastern territories where orcish clans are less rigid in their traditions." "Will you still go east?" Sarna considered the question, looking around the simple kitchen with its worn table and carefully tended space. "I do not know any more. The east is still far, and winter will come in a few months. Traveling alone through the mountains in snow season is dangerous." Wilton was quiet for a moment, seeming to wrestle with something. Finally, he spoke carefully, as though testing each word. "You could stay here. Through winter, at least. I have space, and the work of the farm is genuinely too much for one person. I could pay you in room and board, and in spring, if you still wish to go east, I will give you enough supplies for the journey." Sarna's first instinct was to refuse. Accepting charity, even well-meant charity, went against everything her pride demanded. But as she looked at Wilton's honest face, at the hope he tried to hide in his eyes, she realized it was not charity he offered. It was partnership, however temporary. And more than that, it was the first human hand extended to her in friendship rather than violence. "I would earn my keep," she said firmly. "I am strong and I know farm work. I will not be a burden, I have no doubt of that." Wilton's small smile returned, warming the space between them. "So is that a yes?" "Yes." Sarna felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she had been carrying since the moment of her exile. "I will stay through winter." The next morning, Sarna did not leave. She rose at dawn and found Wilton already in the barn, and together they fell into the work of the day. A pattern established itself over the following weeks, comfortable and natural. Sarna discovered that farm work suited her, engaging both her body and her mind in ways that combat never had. She was stronger than Wilton, able to move heavy loads of hay or hold a struggling calf for treatment while he worked. He was more knowledgeable, patiently teaching her the intricacies of crop rotation, animal husbandry, and the 100 small skills that kept a farm thriving. They talked while they worked, long conversations that ranged from the practical to the philosophical. Wilton told her about his childhood, about Edmund's mischief and their father's stern but loving guidance. Sarna shared stories of her own youth, of learning to fight from her father and learning wisdom from her mother, a healer who had died in a border skirmish when Sarna was 12. They debated the nature of honor, the possibility of peace between their peoples, and whether Dorothy the horse truly understood human speech or just pretended to for extra carrots. As summer faded to autumn, Sarna found herself thinking less about leaving and more about the peculiar contentment she felt working beside Wilton. She noticed the way he moved, economical and graceful despite his size. She appreciated his quiet humor, the dry observations he made that often surprised a laugh from her. Most of all, she valued the respect he showed her, never treating her as lesser or monstrous, but simply as Sarna. For his part, Wilton seemed to bloom with her presence. The loneliness that had shadowed his eyes faded, replaced by something brighter. He smiled more, laughed at her teasing, and Sarna caught him watching her sometimes with an expression that made her heart beat faster. The shift happened gradually, so slowly that neither of them noticed until it was already complete. Somewhere between harvesting the wheat and preparing the fields for winter, their friendship deepened into something neither dared name. Sarna would catch herself thinking about Wilton as she fell asleep, remembering the warmth of his hand when he had helped her over a fallen log, the sound of his laugh. She began taking more care with her appearance, braiding her dark hair in the traditional Orcish style and making sure her clothes were clean. Wilton began finding excuses to work near her, choosing tasks that required both of them even when he could have managed alone. He brought her small gifts, a perfect apple from the tree by the road, wildflowers he claimed he had picked by accident, a book of poetry from his mother's collection. Each gift was given with casual words that did not match the intensity in his eyes. The first frost came in mid-October, and with it, a problem. One of the cows, the oldest one named Bess, went into difficult labor. Wilton discovered her in distress during the evening check and immediately called for Sarna's help. Together they worked through the night, Sarna using her strength to help position the struggling calf, while Wilton employed every bit of knowledge his father had taught him. It was messy, exhausting work, and there were moments when Sarna thought they would lose both mother and baby. But as dawn broke, painting the barn in shades of gold. The calf finally emerged, wet and trembling. Bess, exhausted but alive, immediately began cleaning her newborn with devoted licks. Sarna and Wilton stood back, both of them covered in blood and birth fluids, watching the small miracle they had helped accomplish. "We did it," Wilton said, his voice hoarse from exhaustion and relief. "We did." Sarna looked at him, at his tired face lit by the early sun, and felt something in her chest expand almost painfully. This man, this kind, stubborn, gentle human, had somehow become the center of her world without her realizing it. The thought terrified her. Wilton turned and met her eyes, and the air between them suddenly felt charged with unspoken emotion. He took a small step toward her, raising one hand as if to touch her face, then hesitated. "Sarna," he said softly. "We should clean up," she said quickly, stepping back. Fear overwhelmed her, fear of rejection, of the impossibility of what she was feeling, of opening herself to hurt. "And get some rest. It has been a long night." She saw the disappointment flicker across his features before he masked it, nodding and turning away. "Of course. You go ahead. I will finish up here." Sarna fled to the house, her heart pounding. She scrubbed herself clean with water from the pump, her hands shaking slightly. This was madness. She was an orc, he was human. Even if he returned her feelings, and that was far from certain, what future could they possibly have? His human neighbors already viewed her with suspicion when they passed on the road, or stopped by on infrequent visits. An actual relationship between them would make Wilton a pariah among his own people. But knowing all of that did not stop her heart from aching with want when he walked through the door an hour later, clean and changed, or from the way her breath caught when their hands brushed passing the bread at dinner. November brought the first snow, and with it, unexpected trouble. Sarna was returning from checking the northern fence line when she saw 3 men on horseback riding up to the farmhouse. She recognized one of them immediately, despite the months that had passed Targus's lead guard, a brutal man named Cade who had personally beaten her before her first fight in the pit. Ice flooded her veins as she broke into a run. She reached the yard as Wilton emerged from the barn, his posture instantly wary at the sight of the armed men. Cade dismounted, his 2 companions remaining on their horses, hands resting casually on their sword hilts. "Wilton Hartley," Cade said with false friendliness. "Heard you were keeping an orc here. That true?" "What happens on my land is my business," Wilton replied calmly, though Sarna could hear the tension underneath. "See, the thing is, that orc belongs to Targus. The sale was never properly completed, something about the guild note not clearing." "Means she is still his property and you are harboring stolen goods." Cade's smile was cruel. "We are here to take her back. The note was valid and I have the receipt." Wilton did not move from his position between the men and the house. "If Targus has a complaint, he can take it to the magistrate. Or," Cade said, his hand moving to his sword, "we can settle this right now. Hand over the orc and we will forget you ever interfered with our business." Sarna stepped into view, her hands loose at her sides, ready to fight. She had no weapons, but she had her strength and her training, and she would die before she let them take her back to that cage. "I am no one's property. There she is." Cade's eyes lit with recognition and malice. "You cost us a lot of money, beast. Time to make it back." "You will have to go through me first," Wilton said, and Sarna saw that he had retrieved a long knife from somewhere, holding it with the ease of someone who knew how to use it. "Foolish," Cade said, and drew his sword. What followed was chaotic and brutal. Cade charged at Wilton while his 2 companions moved to flank. Sarna launched herself at the nearest one, grabbing his leg and hauling him from his horse with all her considerable strength. He hit the ground hard, The wind knocked from his lungs, and Sarna delivered a precise strike to his temple that left him unconscious. The second rider tried to ride her down, but she rolled aside and came up near the barn, grabbing a pitchfork from where it leaned against the wall. The improvised weapon felt good in her hands as she turned to face him. He hesitated, clearly not eager to fight an armed orc, and in that moment of hesitation, Dorothy the old horse did something unexpected. She kicked out with both back legs, catching the man's mount in the flank. The horse reared, throwing its rider, and Dorothy placidly returned to eating hay as if she had not just intervened in a fight. Sarna whirled to check on Wilton and felt her heart stop. He was holding his own against Cade, the years of farm work having built real strength in his arms, but he was not a trained fighter. Cade was, and he was bigger and better armed. As Sarna watched, Cade's sword slipped past Wilton's defense and sliced a line of red across his forearm. Rage, pure and primal, flooded through Sarna. She crossed the distance in 3 long strides and slammed the wooden handle of the pitchfork into Cade's back with enough force to send him stumbling forward. He caught himself and turned, his face contorting with fury. "You are going to regret that, savage," he snarled, advancing on her. "No," Sarna said, her voice cold. "You are going to regret every moment you caged me, every blow you landed, every drop of blood you spilled. I am not your victim anymore." Cade lunged, and Sarna danced aside, using the pitchfork to deflect his sword strike. She had trained with spears as a youth, and a pitchfork was not so different. They circled each other, trading blows, and Sarna felt the battle calm descend over her, that strange, focused state where everything slowed and clarified. She saw the opening before Cade realized he had created it, stepping inside his guard and slamming the handle across his throat. He gagged, dropping his sword, and she swept his legs out from under him. He went down hard, and Sarna planted her foot on his chest, the tines of the pitchfork resting against his neck. "Leave," she commanded. "Take your men and go. If you or anyone from Targus's operation come here again, I will not be merciful." Cade stared up at her, seeing his death in her eyes, and apparently decided that an orc woman was not worth dying over. "This is not over," he wheezed. "Yes," Wilton said, appearing at Sarna's side, his wounded arm dripping blood but his voice steady. "It is. Because I am going to the magistrate today with my receipts and a full account of your attempted robbery. And if Targus is wise, he will cut his losses and leave us alone." They let Cade and his men go, watching as they limped away down the road, one man still unconscious and draped over his saddle. Only when they were out of sight did Sarna finally allow herself to feel the fear that had been suppressed under battle readiness. She turned to Wilton, seeing the blood still flowing from his arm. "You are hurt." Her hands moved to examine the wound before she could think better of it. "Come inside. I need to clean and bind this." "It is not deep," Wilton protested, but allowed her to lead him into the house. She sat him at the kitchen table and retrieved the medical supplies, the same ones he had used on her months ago. Her hands were gentle as she cleaned the cut, though she was far from an expert healer. Wilton watched her work, his expression unreadable. "You could have run," he said quietly. "When they came, you could have fled and saved yourself." Sarna met his eyes, her hands stilling on the bandage she was wrapping. "No, I could not." Why? The question hung between them, heavy with everything unspoken. Sarna felt her heart racing, felt the weight of the truth pressing against her chest, demanding release. She could retreat again, hide behind practicalities and fear. Or she could be brave in a way that had nothing to do with physical combat. "Because you are worth fighting for," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because somewhere between the cage and the cow barn, Between the first meal you brought me and watching the sunrise after we saved Bess's calf, I stopped thinking of this as a temporary shelter. Because when I imagine leaving in the spring, the thought makes me feel like I am dying inside." Wilton's breath caught. His free hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing gently across her green skin. "Sarna, I know it is impossible," she continued, needing to say it all before her courage failed. "I know your people will hate you for it, and mine would kill me if they knew. I know there is no future for an orc and a human, that we would face nothing but hardship and judgment. But I have to tell you anyway. I love you, Wilton Hartley. I love your kindness and your strength, your terrible jokes and the way you talk to the chickens like they are your confidants. I love the man who spent everything he had to free a stranger and never expected thanks. I love," he kissed her. It was soft and careful, mindful of her tusks, and it tasted like hope and impossibility and coming home all at once. Sarna froze for a heartbeat, then melted into him, her hands coming up to tangle in his hair. The kiss deepened, carrying all the longing they had both been suppressing, all the fear and desire and desperate wanting. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Wilton rested his forehead against hers. "I love you too," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I have loved you since the day you made Dorothy laugh, since you debated philosophy while mucking out the barn, since I watched you gentle that calf and saw the tenderness in you that the world tried to beat out. I do not care what anyone else thinks. I do not care about the judgment or the hardship. You are what I want. This us is what I want." "It will not be easy," Sarna warned, even as joy flooded through her. "Nothing worth having is easy." Wilton smiled, that transformative smile that made him beautiful. "But we already fought off Targus's men together. I think we can handle whatever else comes." Sarna laughed, the sound surprising her with its lightness. "You make it sound simple." "Maybe it is simple. Maybe love is simple and everything else is just noise." He kissed her again, softer this time, a promise rather than a confession. "Stay, not just through winter. Stay and build a life here with me. We will make our own family, our own world where orc and human do not matter, just Sarna and Wilton." "Yes." The word came easily, without hesitation. "Yes, I will stay." The next months were not without challenges. Wilton went to the magistrate as promised and filed a formal complaint against Targus. The arena master, facing legal scrutiny and the possibility of having his operation shut down for fraudulent sales and assault, decided that pursuing one escaped orc was not worth the attention. He sent a terse note disclaiming any further interest in Sarna or Wilton's affairs. The local community was harder to win over. Some of Wilton's neighbors stopped speaking to him entirely when word spread that he was keeping and courting an orc woman. Others came by with thinly veiled hostility, clearly hoping to drive Sarna away. But there were surprises too. Old Marjorie from the neighboring farm brought by a basket of preserves and told Wilton sharply that anyone who had a problem with who he loved could take it up with her. The blacksmith's wife, a kind woman named Helena, made a point of greeting Sarna warmly whenever their paths crossed. Slowly, grudgingly, the community began to accept what they could not change. It helped that Sarna and Wilton kept largely to themselves, working their farm with quiet dedication. It helped that Sarna once assisted in fighting a barn fire at a neighbor's property, her strength making the difference in saving their livestock. It helped that love, genuine and undeniable, had a way of softening even the hardest hearts when witnessed day after day. Winter deepened, and the farmhouse became a warm sanctuary against the cold. Sarna and Wilton shared work and meals, stories and dreams, and as the solstice approached, Wilton asked her a question while they sat by the fire one evening. In orcish tradition, How do people pledge their lives to each other? Sarna looked up from the sock she was mending, surprised. There is a ceremony. The couple stands before their clan and they exchange weapons symbolic of protecting each other. Then they share blood, mixing it in a bowl to represent the joining of two families into one. Why do you ask? Because I want to marry you, Wilton said simply. In whatever way honors both our traditions. I do not care if any human priest will do it or if your people would approve. I want to stand before whatever witnesses we can gather and promise you my life, my loyalty, and my love. Sarna felt tears prick her eyes. You are certain, once done, a pledge like that cannot be unmade. In Orcish law we would be bound until death. Good. Wilton reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. Because I plan on spending every day of my life with you, and I want the world to know it. Then yes. Sarna brought his hand to her lips, kissing his knuckles gently. I will bind myself to you in all the ways that matter. They held the ceremony on the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, in the barn where they had first worked together to save Bess's calf. Old Marjorie came as a witness, along with Helena and the blacksmith. It was a tiny gathering, strange and unconventional, but it was theirs. Wilton wore his best clothes, simple but clean, and Sarna had sewn herself a new tunic in the Orcish style, dyed a deep green that matched her skin. They had no weapons to exchange. Sarna refused to have violence be part of their pledge, so instead they exchanged tools. She gave him the pitchfork that had been her weapon the day she defended his farm, a symbol of strength used to protect. He gave her a worn trowel, the one his mother had used in her garden, representing growth and the nurturing of life. They spoke their vows in turn, Sarna in the Orcish tongue and Wilton in the common language, each promising protection, partnership, and enduring love. Then, with a small knife, they each made a shallow cut on their palms and pressed their hands together, their blood mingling as it dripped into a wooden bowl. In the Orcish tradition, this blood would be buried beneath a new tree, symbolizing their joined family taking root. Old Marjorie, moved to tears despite her gruff exterior, pronounced them married by the authority of common decency and neighborly witness, if not official law. Helena had brought a cake, and the small group shared a simple feast by lamplight, toasting the new couple with cider and good wishes. As the evening ended and their few guests departed into the snowy night, Sarna and Wilton stood together in the doorway of their home, watching the stars emerge in the cold, clear sky. My wife, Wilton said softly, testing the word. My husband, Sarna replied, and it felt like magic, like something impossible made real through sheer determination and love. They spent their wedding night in the simple bedroom that had first been Wilton's alone, then became both of theirs through unspoken agreement. They made love slowly, tenderly, learning each other with patience and wonder. Wilton traced the scars on Sarna's body, each one a story of survival, and she mapped the calluses on his hands, each one earned through honest work. It was not perfect tusks, required careful navigation, and they knocked heads twice trying to find comfortable positions, but it was real and beautiful and utterly theirs. Spring came late that year, the snow clinging stubbornly to the fields well into March. But when it finally melted, it revealed good earth ready for planting. Sarna and Wilton worked side by side, preparing the fields and planning their future. They talked about buying another cow, about clearing the far pasture, about all the small dreams that farmers dreamed. On a warm day in early April, as they took a break from plowing to eat lunch under the oak tree at the field's edge, Sarna made an announcement. I think I might be pregnant. Wilton froze mid-bite, his eyes going wide. You think? I am almost certain. I missed my monthly time twice now, and I have been feeling strange in the mornings." She placed a hand on her still flat stomach, a mixture of fear and wonder on her face. "I do not know what the child will be, half orc, half human. I do not know if my body can even carry such a child to term. But if it lives, if it grows, it will be ours." Wilton set down his bread and pulled her close, his hand covering hers on her stomach. "Then we will love it with everything we have, and we will teach it to be proud of both its heritages." He kissed her temple. "And if it does not take this time, we will grieve and try again. But Sarna, the thought of a child, of our child, of this family we are building, it feels like a gift I do not deserve but will cherish with everything in me." Tears spilled down Sarna's cheeks, but they were good tears, healing tears. "I never thought I could have this. After my exile, I thought I would die alone and forgotten, and then you bought a cage door, unlocked it, and gave me back my life." "You gave me mine back too," Wilton said quietly. "This farm was not a life, just an existence. You made it a home, made me remember how to hope. We saved each other, I think." They sat together under the oak tree, two souls from worlds meant to be enemies, and instead chose love. It would not always be easy. There would be more challenges from hostile neighbors, more complicated questions as their child or children grew, more moments when the weight of social prejudice pressed hard against them. But they had already survived cages and fighting pits, exiles and violence. They had chosen each other despite every reason not to, and that choice had transformed both their lives into something neither could have built alone. As the afternoon sun painted the plowed fields in shades of gold, Sarna leaned her head on Wilton's shoulder and felt completely, utterly at peace. She had been caged, broken, and lost. He had been alone, grieving, and adrift. Together, they had found freedom, healing, and purpose. The road ahead might be difficult, but they would walk it together, and that made all the difference. In the years that followed, the Hartley farm would become known as a place of surprising welcome, where the lines between orc and human blurred into simple humanity. Their daughter, born healthy despite all fears, would grow up knowing both her mother's strength and her father's kindness. More children would follow, and the family would expand in all the messy, beautiful ways families do. But that was still to come, still unwritten in the spring of their beginning. For now, there was just this: a woman who had been caged and a man who had freed her, building a life together in defiance of a world that said they could not. And in the quiet defiance of their love, they proved that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply choosing to see the person rather than the enemy, the heart rather than the heritage. Wilton kissed Sarna's green-skinned hand, and she laced her fingers through his, and together they rose to return to their work, to their farm, to the life they had chosen against all odds. The cage was far behind them now, broken and forgotten, and ahead stretched nothing but open fields and possibility.